Good evening. Welcome to This Week in Turkey. Tonight we're starting our program with our guest, Max Hoffman, who's joining us from Washington, D.C. to talk about the Center for American Progress survey on Turkey's new nationalism. Hoffman is the Associate Director of National Security and International Policy at the CAP and will answer our questions on their recent work on Turkey. Good evening, Mr. Hoffman. Welcome to This Week in Turkey.
Good evening. Good to be with you.
So can you give us some brief information about the scope and methodology of your research?
Sure. Well, we did one nationwide poll, polling 2,453 Turkish citizens across Turkey in 26 provinces. This was based on the Turkish statistical model. It's a good representative sample. It was conducted by the polling firm Metropol, which is well known in Turkey. And the questions were all probing issues of Turkish nationalism, Turkish national identity. We embarked on this research because we had seen over the past really 4 years what we thought might be a new wave of Turkish nationalism with some new components and new textures to it taking shape. Of course, this has been dramatically escalated since the July 15th coup attempt in 2016, but I think some of these nationalist tendencies predate that. And so we wanted to try and better understand that, better understand how Turks today are thinking about their self-perception, their national identity, and you know, with the goal of better understanding Turkey today. The nationwide poll was the first of two. We plan to conduct the second. It was based on a round of focus groups we conducted in Turkey late last year, where we had a older AKP group, a younger AKP group, an MHP group, and a CHP group. We asked through a moderator, we were asking these people to talk about their experiences, talk about the way they think about Turkish national identity, and test out some ideas. And from that, we designed questions for this poll. It's a big sweeping poll. We have a lot of really interesting data that breaks down by demography and age and ethnicity and things like that. So hopefully we can get into some of it. But broadly speaking, we feel that there's a lot of continuity with long-standing trends in Turkish nationalism, but there are some new components that seem to be taking shape that perhaps we can talk about in further detail.
Mm-hmm. So as your poll is titled Turkey's New Nationalism Amid Shifting Politics, can you tell us what's new about the recent wave of Turkish nationalism according to your findings?
Yeah. Well, I'll say what our findings were in a basic way, and then maybe we can talk about what's new and what's not. What we found was that Turkey is in a defensive crouch, really, after 5-6 years of profound security threats. Not just the coup attempts, but also the war in Syria and the spillover from that, and of course the Kurdish conflict. And so after years of security threats and also years of really quite strong populist right-wing rhetoric from President Erdogan and other leaders, the country was in a defensive crouch. It feels threatened, it feels very insecure, and it also feels betrayed by its traditional Western security partners, particularly the United States. And so the result of that is that many Turks want to express a desire to sort of go their own way, to have Turkey assert its sovereignty at home and in the region, carve its own path, worry only about its own interests, and not worry so much about appeasing Western powers or maintaining alliances with the likes of the United States. And so there's this deep hostility and distrust towards the West that we found across political parties, not just on the right wing or the nationalist right wing. And we found that President Erdogan remains this very deeply polarizing figure in Turkey. About half the country supports him very strongly, and half the country very strongly opposes him. That's not new, but there were some rumblings among younger conservatives that seemed to indicate that Erdogan and the AKP, after more than 15 years ruling the country, are beginning to be viewed as the political establishment in a way that maybe was not the case previously. The other interesting things we found were this really rising nativist wave. There's a lot of hostility towards Syrian refugees, which is not totally new, but seems to have escalated in the last year or two. Of course, most of the world has admired Turkey in this remarkable story of caring for the refugees and absorbing so many Syrians into society quite peacefully, quite generously. But there is really emotional and deeply felt hostility towards the refugees at this point. So that was new, and that underpinned this kind of rising right-wing nativist trend. This is not just limited to Turkey, of course. You see similar trends in Europe and here in the United States, unfortunately. But it was something interesting. There were also some reappropriations of traditional Turkish icons like Ataturk, and there was, which we can get into further, and there was a sort of a belief that Turkey is a strong leader in the Muslim world, which has always been there on the AKP side, but is now widely accepted, that maybe we can revisit. So those were some of the big findings of our poll. Now, many of those have trends running back, of course, into Turkish Republican history. Ataturk and Turkish textbooks going back decades taught that Turkey was surrounded by enemies, was always under threat. This legacy in some ways goes back to the birth of the modern republic and coming out of the ashes of the Ottoman Empire. But the AKP, 15 years ago, took power and said, we're no longer surrounded by enemies. And Erdogan and Davutoglu and others tried to say, no, zero problems with neighbors. We're not surrounded by enemies. We're going to go out confidently into the world, and we're going to cooperate with the world, trade with the world. That seems to be largely left behind, and now it's this very nationalist kind of go-it-alone attitude that is once again dominant in Turkish national thought.
So you've made some references to a number of the important components of your poll that we're going to delve into in a couple of minutes. But let's start with perhaps one of the most visible of them, namely the legacy of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, the founder of modern Turkey. So what do your findings suggest about the legacy of Atatürk? Is it alive and well?
Certainly. Ataturk remains by far the most popular figure among Turks. That's not a surprise. That's not new. But 82% of Turks have a favorable opinion of Ataturk, including 80% in the AKP. So there's sometimes this idea that the AKP constituency is skeptical of Ataturk's legacy, because I think most of us see Ataturk's legacy as shorthand for secularism, and suspected that the AKP constituents were maybe more hostile towards secularism. That doesn't come through in the poll. What is interesting, though, is that the legacy is contested, right? Everybody loves Ataturk, but Ataturk means very different things to different people in Turkey. And this gets into some of the focus groups' observations as well. For most CHP and many MHP voters, Ataturk is, of course, the founder of the secular republic, and secularism is at the heart of his legacy. For some MHP and many AKP voters, Ataturk is conceived of more as the a nationalist leader, an independent leader who stood up to the West, who fought the West and defeated them militarily. And he has this kind of nationalist, militarist legacy that they focus on that part more than perhaps the secularist legacy. There are even some among the AKP who are trying to reinvent Ataturk and almost move beyond the secular legacy he left. One AKP respondent, for example, said that, well, I'll always love Ataturk because he translated the Quran into Turkish for me. And so almost this reappropriation of Ataturk as a pseudo-religious figure as well. So what we see is that there's uniform agreement that Ataturk is positive, a great Turkish leader. But then after that, in terms of what his legacy means, the consensus breaks down. And so we asked the question, do you think that the reforms of Ataturk are under attack today? And there you see a stark partisan divide. The AKP feel no, for the most part feel that no, Ataturk's reforms are not under attack. The republic he founded is alive and well. The CHP and the rest of the opposition really all feel that, yes, of course, Ataturk's reforms are under attack. It was about secularism, and the AKP is moving the country in a different direction. So there's no consensus there. We also asked whether Erdogan is fulfilling the legacy of Ataturk. And again, as you'd expect, stark partisan divides there. The AKP voters feel that Erdogan is a strong leader who's fulfilling Ataturk's legacy, I think they see Erdogan standing up to the West and sort of getting in these arguments with the West, and they see echoes of Ataturk's very independent mindset towards the West, whereas most of the opposition feel, no, of course, Erdogan is attacking Ataturk's legacy, he's undermining secularism, and he's taking Turkey, more deeply into the Middle East, for example, which was not something Ataturk sought to do. So it's a contested legacy, and you see both sides of the political divide appealing to Ataturk's legacy and trying to reappropriate him or take ownership of his legacy in order to win current political debates. So even 100 years after his life, really, or not quite, but 75 years after his life, Ataturk continues to dominate Turkish politics to a remarkable extent.
Mm-hmm. Let's move on to a different component of your poll now. So in the analysis report, you've claimed that, I quote, "The polling data suggests that the AKP is not really an Islamist party, as it's frequently described." Can you expand on this? What exactly do you mean?
Yes, well, often the Turkish opposition and outside observers, including myself, I've done this a few times, there's this tendency to regard the AKP as an Islamist party, or sometimes refer to it as a moderate Islamist party. That's kind of a shorthand, particularly in the West, and we were partly aiming this at the Western observers who do this. Because there's a belief that, okay, well, they've advanced a religious conservative vision for Turkey, and so it's an Islamist party. What our polling showed was that wasn't really the case, that the AKP is more of a conservative nationalist party with a small but very important, very active religious conservative base. So only about 30 to 35% of the AKP electorate or constituency could really be described as Islamist in any meaningful way. So about 35% say that they don't support a secular republic, 35% of the AKP. About 20% said that they would support the return of the caliphate. 25% said they would support Sharia law. So these are not insignificant numbers, and if you are a Turkish secularist, I can see why they might alarm you, but it's still a very small portion of the AKP that feel this way. Really, it's again more of a nationalist and social conservative party. That doesn't mean that religion is unimportant for 75% of AKP voters. Certainly not. I think that much of the AKP constituency responds to Erdogan's religiously tinged rhetoric, for example. They think that secularism is important, but it doesn't mean the complete exclusion of religion from all of public life. So they welcome religion and sort of more touches of religion in the public life and in political rhetoric, but they still believe in the secular foundation of the republic, and they don't want religious rule or religious law in a meaningful sense. So that's what we mean when we said that it's not really an Islamist party. But what's interesting is thinking about this AKP balancing act between this small 25-35% of real religious conservatives and Islamists versus the rest of the party that's more conservative nationalist party. It's a difficult balancing act politically because, for example, the religious conservatives, who we call compassionate Islamists as a shorthand, they value things like the care for Syrian refugees. They really care about Syrian rebels, for example, and caring for the Ummah, and they want Turkey to be a benevolent Islamic power in the world. The conservative nationalists, a portion of which we call Turkey firsters, because they have these really nativist nationalist attitudes on the right wing of that bloc. They are very different. They hate the presence of the Syrian refugees. They want them gone. They are skeptical of involvement in the Middle East. They're very anti-Kurdish. They hate the religious educational moves that Erdogan and the AKP have made, for example, the Imam Hatip schools. So it's a tough balancing act between these two constituencies for Erdogan and the AKP. And we think that it's important for people to understand that the AKP is not monolithic and that there are these different constituent parts to this ruling party and its setup.
And what have you found about the different responses to the failed coup attempt of 2016? Yeah.
First of all, it's a very sensitive question, and we were encouraged that people, despite the crackdown in Turkey on many forms of political expression, that people felt free to speak their minds on this question. Overall, a narrow plurality of Turks approve of the government's response to the coup. So about 49% approve, 39% disapprove. But there are big party divides, as you'd expect. So the AKP thinks that the coup response was fine. The MHP is okay with the coup response. CHP, HDP think it was very, very bad. When you ask beyond that, you ask about the crackdown on journalists and intellectuals and activists, and ask if it was appropriate or inappropriate. There you get a really deeply divided nation. So 44% think the crackdown is appropriate, 44% think it's not appropriate, deeply divided between parties primarily. But I'd say that even 59% of MHP voters think that the crackdown is inappropriate. We further asked what voters felt was the reason for the crackdown. And whether it was a legitimate threat to the nation or whether they had begun to use this as a tool to root out political dissent. And basically all of the opposition felt it was a tool just being used to end dissent. The AKP mostly felt it was legitimate, that there were real threats. The MHP also felt there were real threats. So you see the sort of parts of this national alliance that Erdogan is trying to build with the MHP, or part of the MHP. And then one important note that shows to which conservative nationalist Turks, AKP and MHP, feel that the coup response has not gone far enough. Of the AKP and MHP voters who were unhappy with the government coup response, a big majority of them were unhappy because it hadn't gone far enough. So these are voters who feel that even with hundreds of thousands of people purged and many thousands arrested and the vast restructuring of the state, that the government still hasn't gone far enough in responding to the coup. So that's a pretty remarkable statement. I would speculate that this might be people in the MHP and AKP who feel that the response is not yet rooted out the AKP sympathizers with the coup plotters, or the supposed coup plotters. So that's a pretty remarkable statement of just how nationalists and how sort of threatened the conservative side of the electorate feels after this coup attempt.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Hoffman, self-perception seems to be a recurring theme throughout your analysis of the results of this poll. Can you tell us what exactly you found about the changes in Turks' self-perception?
Yeah, I mean, this is a very complicated question, of course. There was broad agreement among Turks of all political stripes on what it meant to be a Turk. And that was a belief in strong families, support for the Turkish military, speaking the Turkish language, the sorts of things you would expect. There was also broad agreement, even among CHP voters, HDP voters, that Islam was a central part of Turkish identity. So there was real consensus on all of those issues. The idea of national identity starts to break down when you get into questions of strong leadership, for example. The AKP and the MHP feel that strong leadership, and often strong leader like Erdogan, is important to protect the country and protect the Turkish people. There's more skepticism of that among the political opposition. One of the interesting changes is that is from years past, is this broad agreement that Turkey is a natural leader for the Muslim world. That you'd expect to see that in the AKP and maybe to an extent in the MHP, but really CHP and even HDP voters agree that Turkey is a natural leader for the Muslim world. That's, I think, something new, and that shows that even for people who disagree with Erdogan and the AKP's political platform or foreign policy, they have succeeded in redefining the sort of parameters of Turkish politics. So these are all political arguments taking place within this assumption that yes, Turkey will be a strong leader in the Muslim world. It will assert itself regionally. It will assert itself in situations, for example, the Rohingya crisis or the Jerusalem issue or Sudan or Somalia, that yes, this is going to be Turkey's role, that this is an active Muslim power. That would have been very, very disputed just 10, 15 years ago, let alone 25 years ago or back in Ataturk's time. That's something new in Turkish national perception. And then the depths of the hostility towards the West and really skepticism about international cooperation overall. There's always, Turkey has always been relatively anti-American. In polls going back a long time, very few countries that aren't Turkish poll well at all in Turkey. So only Azerbaijan and now Qatar and Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus ever poll well in Turkey and are popular. But now the West and the U.S. are very, very unpopular. So the U.S. is at 10% approval rating in Turkey. That's really remarkably low. And Russia actually is the most popular of the countries we polled. So 28% approval for Russia, which is still low, but is far higher than the US or Europe or Germany or NATO or any of these other entities. So I think we're at the trough, the lowest point of Turkish attitudes towards the West and towards international cooperation for a long time. And we'll have to see if that lasts. If that lasts, it will represent an important shift in Turkish, sort of public perception.
Mm-hmm. Let's move our focus now to another very important component of the results of your poll, which is attitudes towards immigrants and refugees, and Syrian refugees in particular. So the polling results suggest that Turks are actually pretty much divided in their attitudes towards Syrian refugees. And actually a particularly interesting finding shows that approval for Erdogan correlates with attitudes about Turkey's care for refugees. Can you expand on this a little bit?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the first, basically across political party, there is real hostility towards the presence of refugees. And 78% say Turkey spends too much on the refugees. 49% strongly agree with that proposition. Even in the AKP, where there's this compassionate Islamist constituency, still 73% feel that too much is being spent on the refugees and that Turkey should focus on its own citizens, and 45% strongly feel that way. So there's really only a small group of the AKP, about 20% of the AKP, that support the refugee policy. The rest of the country is very hostile towards the Syrians. This came through in extremely visceral terms in the focus groups. And anyone who walks around, talks to people in Istanbul or Ankara will also encounter this. You'd hear things like, I live in Fatih and I never hear Turkish spoken anymore. It's all Arabic. Or all of the signs in the supermarket are in Arabic. I feel like a stranger in my own country. Those sorts of attitudes that are really emotionally held. People would complain that they wouldn't get pension checks on time, but that Turkey would care for these refugees and give them free health care. So there's this real resentment. And that's not remarkable. I mean, what's remarkable is how generous Turkey has been so far, and that this hasn't really erupted into a real nativist right-wing political campaign against the refugees, like we saw in Europe or even in the United States in 2016 and 2017. But it's clear that people are very angry about it. And as you mentioned, the statistic, how it correlates with approval for Erdogan, I think that the AKP and Erdogan realize that the refugees are a real political liability for them. And I believe that that's why they have begun really highlighting how efforts to return refugees to Syria, they've tried to head off any right-wing political challenge from someone like Meral Akşener or another right-wing leader by saying that Euphrates Shield or Olive Branch operations are both to clear safe zones so that the Syrians can go back, that we're going to resettle 350,000 Syrians here and 150,000 Syrians there. These messages are aimed at those right-wing voters who are angry about the refugees, but might otherwise be AKP core AKP voters or MHP voters who might consider voting for the AKP. So those are crucial political constituencies for Erdogan going into the elections, and he knows that they're angry about the refugees, and he's trying to placate them. That's what I believe is driving a lot of this rhetoric and even these operations to some extent. He's also, done two other things to try and kind of sidetrack the anger about the refugees and the anger really about the overall direction of the country. Because most people are pessimistic about the direction of the country, about the economy. So, these are worrying political polling numbers for Erdogan in many ways. But he's done two things to head that off, to appeal to right-wing conservative nationalists. And one is constantly picking fights with the West, particularly the US and Europe, but really the US mainly. That's very popular among both religious conservatives and conservative nationalists and Turkish nationalists and MHP voters. They really like this aggressive, independent line standing up to the US. So he's done a lot of that, as we know. And the other thing is a very, very hawkish position on the Kurdish issue. Now, this goes back to 2015 after the June elections and the resumption of the conflict with the PKK. But Erdogan has taken this very aggressive line on the Kurdish question to head off any right-wing nationalist challenge. So he's taken the air out of the room for any challenger like Akşener who would want to run at him from the right.
Mr. Hoffman, finally, what can you tell us about the changing attitudes towards foreign policy in Turkey?
Well, as I mentioned, there's this assumption that Turkey will be a very active player in the Muslim world. That's somewhat new. Turkey was frozen into its position really by the Cold War, and with the end of the Cold War, slowly start to assert itself in the Middle East and the wider world. But it was very contested for the early years, and now the AKP really won that argument, and everybody assumes and supports the idea that Turkey will be active worldwide. The other thing is this rapprochement with Russia. Now, Russia's polling numbers have been very volatile. So, just back in November 2015, when Turkey had shut down a Russian jet, this was really deep hostility towards Russia, mistrust. But now Russia is the most popular of the countries we polled. So it could change again. But clearly, Erdogan is trying to build that relationship. The last thing, of course, is the relationship with the West and particularly the U.S. The U.S. is at 10%. Europe is at 21% approval. NATO's at 24% approval. So there's anger. And then we further asked, do you support confronting the U.S. or maintaining the alliance? Doing more to confront the U.S. or more to maintain the alliance? And a majority now favor confrontation with the U.S. over maintaining the alliance. That's a pretty remarkable number. The thing I would say, though, is that a lot of this may be sort of anger and emotional rather than a desire to, leave NATO or join the Shanghai Cooperation Organization or take really dramatic steps like that. Because when we asked who gets more out of the alliance, Turkey, the U.S., or both countries, or neither country, most Turks still, even in the AKP and the MHP, still see value in the alliance with the U.S., still see value for Turkey and for both countries and for the U.S. So, we'll see how this plays out. What I'd say is that Erdogan has made anti-Western rhetoric and anti-American rhetoric a core part of his political campaigning, a core part of his message, and his constituents expect that now. They like that kind of talk. And it makes it difficult when some crisis happens or there's some tension in the relationship as there is now. It makes it difficult to walk back your position. So if Erdogan says, we're going to stand up to the West, we're going to stand up to the U.S., we don't need them, and then something happens and there are tensions, it's very difficult for a leader like Erdogan to then back down. So that creates a really dangerous situation moving forward.
Mr. Hoffman, thank you very much for your comments and for being with us tonight.
Thank you for having me.
We'll continue with our next video now. Doğan Holding announced on Thursday that it had started talks with Demirören Holding on the sale and transfer of its media outlets.
Doğan Medya, Turkey's largest media group, announced on Thursday that it is in talks with Demirören Holding, a business group close to President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, for the sale of its outlets. In a notice to Turkey's Capital Markets Board, Doğan Holding said it was negotiating the sale of outlets, including flagship newspaper Hürriyet, the mass circulation daily Posta, CNN Turk, and Kanal D television channels, and Doğan News Agency, to Demirören Holding. Doğan Holding said the sale was worth $890 million. Doğan news outlets were deemed to be among the few relatively independent media in Turkey. Most news outlets in Turkey are currently allied with the government. In a message to his employees, Doğan Holding's owner Ardından confirmed that his company had signed a preliminary protocol with Demirören Holding. At this stage, I have decided to voluntarily put an end to my profession as a publisher, he said. Erol Önderoğlu, the Turkey representative of Reporters Without Borders, said the sale of Doğan Holding means the death of pluralism and independent journalism in Turkey's mainstream media. The government now has complete control over the media in the run-up to general elections in 2019, Önderoğlu added.
Turkish armed forces announced on March 18th that the Turkish-backed Syrian rebels have taken full control of the city center of Afrin.
On Sunday, March 18th, Turkish-backed Syrian rebels seized control of the city center of Afrin, the target of a 2-month-old military operation by the Turkish armed forces against the Kurdish People's Protection Units, YPG. President Recep Tayyip Erdogan announced the takeover of the city in a speech at the commemoration ceremony in Gallipoli, hailing as heroes the Turkish and Syrian soldiers who had accomplished the takeover. The Turkish military released footage of a soldier hanging a Turkish flag from the first-floor balcony of the governor's office in Afrin, as a fighter next to him waved a Syrian opposition flag. On the same day, AFP journalists on the ground reported that the Free Syrian Army fighters began looting the area immediately after the city was seized. Photographs of fighters breaking into shops, restaurants and houses, and leaving with food, electronic equipment, blankets and other goods were published. Turkish officials, meanwhile, said that they would investigate the claims. On Monday, U.S. State Department spokesperson Heather Nauert said the U.S. is concerned about the reports of looting in Afrin. In response, Turkish presidential spokesperson İbrahim Kalın stressed that Turkey had coordinated the operation with Russia, Iran, and United States, and has been very transparent from the start. On the same day, President Erdogan described the takeover of Afrin as a comma in Turkey's efforts to counter the YPG militia, and vowed to expand the military campaign to all Kurdish-held border areas to the east. According to the United Nations, over 100,000 people have been uprooted from their homes in the region. U.S. State Department has said that it was deeply concerned over the humanitarian situation in the area regarding the displaced. The European Union's top diplomat, Federica Mogherini, also criticized the Turkish army's operation in Afrin, calling on Ankara to work to halt the fighting in Syria.
Celebrations were held in Kurdish-majority cities across Turkey for the traditional spring festival of Nevruz on March 21st.
Tens of thousands of people gathered in cities across Turkey for Nevruz, the ancient spring festival that has long been a mark of ethnic pride for Kurds. The celebrations turned into a mass political protest on Wednesday against the government's 2-month-old military campaign against the YPG militia in Syria's Afrin. Police detained dozens of people for chanting slogans in support of the PKK. The state-run Anadolu agency said 22 demonstrators were detained in Istanbul for propaganda supporting the Kurdish militants in Syria that Ankara considers as terrorists. At least 26 others were detained in Izmir and Adana, the agency reported. Police also broke up an unauthorized demonstration in the southeastern city of Batman. Hundreds of others were arrested across the country in the run-up to the Diyarbakır rally, accused of planning illegal protests. Nevruz, an ancient Eurasian festival which falls on the spring equinox, is a hallmark of Kurdish culture in Turkey. Demonstrations for the holiday frequently led to violence during the PKK's 40-year insurgency.
The United Nations called on Turkey to end its 18-month-old state of emergency on Tuesday.
In a report released on Tuesday, the United Nations Human Rights Office said the state of emergency in Turkey, imposed after the failed 2016 coup attempt, should be terminated. According to the UN report, the state of emergency has paved the way to arbitrary detentions and dismissals, infringements on the rights to freedom of association and expression, as well as torture and ill treatment. The violation of human rights in the southeast of Turkey was also mentioned in the report. UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Zeid Ra'ad al-Hussein, said, teachers, judges, and lawyers are dismissed or prosecuted. Journalists are arrested. Media outlets are shut down and websites are blocked. Clearly, the successive states of emergency declared in Turkey have been used to severely and arbitrarily curtail the human rights of a very large number of people. The report describes the use of torture and ill treatment in custody. Turkey has arrested 160,000 people and dismissed 152,000 civil servants since the coup attempt, the report says. In response, the Turkish Ministry of Foreign Affairs has said that the report contains false charges and demonstrates prejudice against Turkey.
The European Court of Human Rights ruled on Tuesday that the right to liberty and the right to freedom of expression of Turkish journalists Şahin Alpay and Mehmet Altan have been violated.
The European Court of Human Rights ruled on Tuesday that the right to liberty and right to freedom of expression of Turkish journalists Şahin Alpay and Mehmet Altan have been violated. The decision stated that the investigating authorities had been unable to demonstrate any factual basis, indicating that either of the journalists had committed the offenses with which they were charged. It also said that both journalists' freedom of expression rights, protected under Article 10 of the European Convention of Human Rights, were severely violated, and that arresting individuals for expressing their opinions is a severe measure. The court also held that Turkey was to pay both Alpay and Altan 21,500 euros each for non-pecuniary damages. Şahin Alpay was jailed in the aftermath of the 2016 failed coup attempt and had been in prison for more than a year. Alpay is accused of links to terrorist groups and attempting to overthrow the government. The Turkish Constitutional Court had ruled in January that Alpay and fellow jailed journalist Altan should be released on the grounds that their rights had been violated. However, local courts refused to release them, arguing that the top court's ruling was not binding. Alpay was released on March 17th, following a second ruling by Turkey's top court, while Altan was handed a life sentence in February over charges of links to the Fethullahist terrorist organization FETÖ, who is blamed for the failed coup attempt, together with his brother Ahmet Altan and veteran journalist Nazlı Ilıcak.
Our friend Edgar Şar did an interview this week on Turkey's experience with authoritarianism through constitutionalism with Andrew Arato from the New School for Social Research.
Were constructed in a very clever way, 26 of them, of which I would say about 20 were quite positive. Yes. In terms of recognition of unions, gender relations, and all kinds of things which liberal Democrats could applaud. These did not attack either democracy or constitutionalism, on the contrary. But about 6 provisions having to do with the Constitutional Court and the judicial oversight were constructed in such a way that formally, I always took them to be attacks on constitutionalism, and I warned all my Turkish friends, both on CNN Turk and in Milliyet, I think, that they should not vote for the whole package because of these amendments. Now, they represented formally an attack on constitutionalism because to reduce the power of the court to review amendments to a 2/3 vote very much weakened it, and of course, even more importantly, by putting new members onto the court, whom the government could select, amounted to a kind of court packing, whose aim is always to produce a court pliant to the interests of government. Now, the reason why I say this is not just an attack on a court, but on constitutionalism, is that by its very definition, constitutionalism represents restraints on the governing authority, on its arbitrary will, forcing it to stay within the limits of the Constitution. Possibility of the Constitutional Court reviewing other constitutional changes. If you want, the goal of those amendments ultimately was to open a free terrain for other amendments. And in this respect, the only ones that we can point to are the ones in 2017. So that's the formal link. The 2010 amendments make the 2017 amendments possible.
Justice Minister Abdülhamit Gül announced this week that an extradition proceeding has been issued for the creator of Çiftlikbank.
Turkey launched legal proceedings against the creator of a Ponzi scheme simulation game that swindled investors out of millions of dollars. Last week, Mehmet Aydın, the founder of Çiftlikbank, fled to Uruguay with more than $100 million in cash and cryptocurrency. The members of Çiftlikbank use real money to buy virtual animals and produce and sell virtual crops. The system promised to double their investments within a year by directing the money raised into actual agricultural investments, including what Aydın claimed in December would be Europe's biggest dairy farm. Aydın and his partners started Çiftlikbank in August 2016, and it quickly took off, reaching 350,000 domestic and 150,000 foreign players as of January. Several state agencies started investigating the game last year, prompting Aydın to invite fellow citizens to the Anatolian site, where he had purchased land to build a dairy farm to convince them it was legal. The game typically offers returns to investors from money paid in by subsequent participants. Participants believe that they are earning returns from their investment. According to a report by the Capital Markets Board, Aydın collected more than 500 million Turkish liras from around 78,000 people between 2016 and 2017. He repaid a total of 398 million liras to 62,000 people, and he transferred the remaining 113 million liras to Northern Cyprus. Justice Minister Abdülhamit Gül said an extradition proceeding for Aydın and a red notice have been issued. Our ministry and prosecutors are following the issue closely, Gül said on Twitter. Our prosecutors are studying the extradition options of this individual. A thorough investigation is being carried out, looking at several aspects of the case, including its international dimension, Gül added. However, the current location of Mehmet Aydın, who reportedly left Uruguay, is unknown.
Now let's take a look at what's on in Istanbul next week.
Fascinated by the Turkish psychedelic sound of the 1970s, Altıngün will be at Babylon stage tomorrow night. In their debut album, On, released from Bango Joe Records, Altıngün gives offer to the trippy sounds of their influences, such as Barış Manço, Sağda Bağcan, and Erkin Koray, enriched with their own thematic signatures and fuzzy tunes. They combine funky rhythms, wah-wah guitars, saz, and analog organs with Turkish folk songs passed from generation to generation. The band has already met with crowds at critically acclaimed festivals, such as Legeshu and Lowlands in the Netherlands, and others such as Banlieue Bleu, Paleo, Montreal Jazz Festival, and Quebec d'été, to name a few. Notre Dame de Paris musical continues at Zorla PSM until March 25th. The musical is the classic love story of Victor Hugo's The Hunchback of Notre Dame, revamped into a modern stage production by Luc Plamondon and Richard Cochante. It will be the first time that crowds in Istanbul will be able to see the much-acclaimed French original version of Notre Dame de Paris, which is selling out worldwide. Audiences all over the world have fallen in love with the show. It has been recorded in the Guinness Book of World Records for the largest sales of tickets ever in the first year of operation.
That's all from This Week in Turkey. Thanks for tuning in and hope to see you again next Friday at 9 p.m. Goodbye.